Thank you. You may be seated. And I want to also thank Joseph again. He chose the hymns for today, and so far we're doing really great. And I think it will continue on. And if you would like to join in reading, either up above or in your book, I'll have to turn to that, number 555, and I'll read a portion, and I'll allow you that you read. How about I read? There it is. It's a nice, nice one here, and I'll read the italics. You read the. Well, maybe no. All right, I'll let you read the italics here. We'll keep it shorter. So it's called "Some Things Will Never Change." So you start, please.
Or you
No, you
start.
You start the book. Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. I keep trying to lure you in, don't I?
Actually, if I read the whole then.
So some things will never change.
Some things will always be the same.
The voice of forest water in the night, a woman's laughter in the dark, the clean, hard rattle of raked gravel, the cricketing stitch of midday in hot meadows, the delicate web of children's voices in bright air.
These things will never change.
This is working out much better. The glitter of sunlight on roughened water, the glory of the stars, the innocence of morning, the smell of the sea and harbors.
These things will always be the same.
The feathery blur and smoky buddings of young boughs, and something there that comes and goes and never can be captured. The thorn of spring, the sharp and tongueless cry.
These things will never change.
The leaf, the blade, the flower, the wind that cries and sleeps and wakes again. The trees, whose stiff arms clash and tremble in the dark, and the dust of lovers long since burned in the earth.
All things belonging to earth will never change.
Buried in the earth, that was. All things proceeding from the earth to seasons, all things that lapse and change and come again upon the earth. These come up from the earth that never changes. They go back into the earth that lasts forever.
Only the earth endures, but it endures forever.
The tarantula, the adder, and the asp also never change.
Pain and death will always be the same.
But under the pavements trembling like a pulse, under the buildings trembling like a cry, under the waste of time, under the hoof of the beast above the broken bones of cities, there will be something growing like a flower.
Something bursting from the earth again, forever deathless, faithful, coming into life like April.
Thank you. And our talk today, which we've given him plenty of time, so I think not for the 3-hour version, the 30-minute version. And I think I'm anticipating this. This is the Mitchell Prehistoric Indian Village Site, Plains, Villages, and Advent of Agriculture. Dr. Adrien Hannus is the professor of anthropology and the director of archaeology at Augustana University. And he worked directly with my stepfather, Bruce Blake, in helping with a lot of the plaques around Sioux Falls and Minnehaha County. And I met him recently at one of his events. They have archaeology events. He may talk a little bit about that, the Archaeology Society. And this site, many people here, has anyone visited this site? So yeah, several people have. So he's going to talk about that site. And I chose this photo, the picture we have up front, because a lot of the work that he does is along sites of Native Americans and in the past, and so that's the reason that I chose that. He's going to talk a lot about some of the artifacts and things they're finding there. So, Dr. Hannus. Well,
Thank you very much. Is this mic working?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. The, Happy Mother's Day. I'll add that. The work at Mitchell we've been involved over there since 1983. And so it's been a long, long adventure. The Mitchell site is probably one of the more important Plains Village sites that exists up here in the upper northern part of the Plains. It's one that, by a series of fluke circumstances, and if you look here, in other words, there are a series of sites over toward the Mississippi River that have a relationship then to the sites that are settled first along the Big Sioux River, then along the James, and then ultimately along the Missouri River. So the Plains Village phenomena extends as far west as the Missouri River. And it's a phenomena then that is important in trying to understand the beginnings of horticulture or agriculture here in the Upper Plains. The source of agriculture in the New World begins in the Central Valley of Mexico about 10,000 years ago. And then over the next number of millennia, gradually, because of humans becoming more involved in certain plants than other plants, you have the emergence of sort of the triad of squash, beans, and corn, and then that's added to with a whole range of other plants. But in any case, people begin migrating out of the Central Valley, going south, east, west, and some coming north, coming into North America. We have the first evidence of corn in a site in New Mexico dating about 3,800 years ago. But you have settlements then being established in the desert southwest, as well as establishments being begun of peoples coming up the Gulf, coming up the Mississippi River. And so then this is just an image of the Mitchell site and an artist's conception. This is a photograph from the 1870s of one of the last Earth Lodge villages up here. But one of the things that happens with considering these villages, this is a piece by Bodmer out of the Maximilian expeditions, an interior. The Mitchell site, to put it in a context, the people that were at Mitchell about 1,000 years ago were people who were ancestral to the Mandan. So you have today you have three groups that are in North Dakota, the three affiliated tribes, the Mandan, the Arikara, and the Hidatsa. Those were the farming groups that come into the northern plains, and over time then established these village cultures. At Mitchell, if you have not visited it, we have a facility that opened 20 years ago this year called the Archaeodome, where we actually enclosed a portion of the site itself covers about 4.5 acres of land. And it's a site that then we encapsulated in this building, roughly 14 to 16,000 square foot floor, and began excavations in very controlled circumstances, which is a great rarity for this part of the North America or into Mesoamerica, because the climate here is certainly not conducive to doing long-term excavations where you could actually open them up and expand them so that you get a very different picture of an archaeological situation. The other thing about the Mitchell site that is important is that the building is supported on a series of concrete columns. When we were putting those columns in, or before they were drilled into place, we excavated each of the positions of those columns to make sure that we fully, collected the cultural material. Out of that, there are 19 columns. Out of those excavations, we took out about 1.5 million artifacts to begin with. So Mitchell is a very rich site, and it's one that the cultural materials in this part of the site, which is, we tried to calculate what would have been the earliest area of the site that would have been occupied. And, because we think the site was occupied for something between about 75 and 100 years, or a generation or two, probably maximally. And it turns out that the cultural deposits go down 12 feet continuous. The reason for that is that you had lodges. The lodges that the people lived in at Mitchell were earth lodges. They were rectilinear. They were about 20 feet wide and about 40 feet long. They probably, and again, trying to understand how you calculate populations in a situation like this, we consider the ethnographic material, villages, the last villages that existed whenever Europeans were contacting the people. Usually one of these lodges would have a family that would be somewhat of an extended family, so maybe 10 people, 12 people in a lodge. At the same time, you understand that these lodges, some of them were being constructed, some of them were deteriorating. At the Mitchell site, we've so far, through electronic subsurface sensing, as well as coring, as well as actual excavation, we've documented about 82 earth lodges that were present in the village during its total period of occupation. But at the same time, you need to understand that at any given moment, there probably weren't more than 15 or 20 lodges that were extant and inhabited. So it's a situation where, trying to get some numbers on population, we're calculating somewhere around 2 to 250 people that would have been present at the village during any given moment in time. The people were gardeners. They were raising, at Mitchell, we've substantiated about 33 different crops that were in the gardens. So what you've got is several varieties of squash, several varieties of beans, a couple of varieties of maize or corn, sunflowers, amaranth, and then you get into a whole range of other plants that probably were both greens or plants that were used in the cooking processes, and also some medicinal plants. So it's a wide and balanced diet. From the aspect of plants, the people also hunted extensively, and from the largest animals that were being procured, the bison, down to small creatures as well. But the bison was a very critical part of the story at Mitchell, because there's a whole set of activities that were going on that formed probably the basis of a very complex trading set of partnerships that reach all the way back to the Mississippi River to, for instance, the site. And by the way, this is just showing you, we do technical drawings of sections of the floor as we go down. The site has extensive cache pits or storage pits, which I'll show you some of. The other thing that I should say about the Archaeodome, so I don't forget this, in all of the years of excavation of Plains Village sites that has been conducted, both especially during the period of the reservoir, dam and reservoir construction on the Missouri, there were hundreds and hundreds of sites that were tested, excavated in part by the archaeological community to try to save the information before it went under the reservoirs and so on. But every single undertaking that I've been able to determine over this long period of time of excavation and investigation has centered on the lodges themselves. In each case, the archaeologists were trying to collect the data, architectural data and so on, the data in the living space. No one had ever looked at the space between lodges. Well, actually, that's the space that people lived in and would have, had their day-to-day activities. So when we constructed this building, there are only 4 lodges that are on the very edge of the total excavation floor. The rest of it is an area that we're looking at the outdoor activities, which has given us a totally different insight into what was going on in these types of villages. One of the things I mentioned, bison, there were huge, huge quantities of bison being taken, processed, and bone grease was being produced. Excuse me here. So this is showing you pits that are, when the animals were processed for the meat, the bone material was then crushed and boiled, and bone grease was extracted. The bone grease then was mixed with dried meat to produce what we would call pemmican. So what you've got here is very macerated bone. The next slide shows, though, that same area, there would have been an indented area here, probably lined with hide that was filled with water, that would have been then hot rocks were lifted into those pits to cause them to boil. All of the ceramics here as well were, the cooking technique was using hot rock into liquid to cause it to boil rather than putting the ceramics directly on a hearth or a fire. And of course, there are great activities that go on for trying to determine the extent and the volume of material that was being produced. We're convinced that the production of bone grease and the production of pemmican was probably being done on an industrial scale at the Mitchell site. So this gives you an artist rendering of, in other words, the pit where they were getting the grease, the maceration of bones, and adding hot rocks from the fire here. Another thing we find is these deep floor cache pits, which were storage pits both for food and for tools. One of the things we found last season that was very exciting was one of these pits that actually still had its clay cap in place. When they would load these pits with material, they would then seal them over with clay to protect them from the elements, because again, this is outdoors that these pits we're looking at. So again, just the archaeological techniques of excavation, you half section it as you go down through it. This then, we began to get into a dense lens of carbonized corn cobs and other plant material here. This is a shallow pit, but it shows, you can see the reddening. So there was a fairly intense fire that was conducted there. So this is not exactly a storage pit, but it was probably a cooking pit that they then sealed over. A lot of our activities involve doing flotation. Every bit of sediment that comes out of the site is initially screened through 1/4 inch hardware cloth or screen. In this case then, we're using 500 micron mesh, or what you could collect plankton through because of the fineness of the mesh, to do what we call flotation, so that you pass water through a tank, pump it into these screens, and then collect the flot or the float material. In this case, out of that particular screening, we got carbonized sunflower seeds, carbonized corn. Again, and what you need for radiocarbon dates, we now have about 50 radiocarbon dates that we've over the many years been able to obtain, which sounds like a horrendous number of dates, but you're trying continually for greater and greater precision. And the thing to understand about radiocarbon dating to begin with, it's not exact calendric dates. It's a situation where there's always a plus or minus factor, so you have to add or delete. Well, when you're saying that a village probably was occupied for 75 to 100 years, those kind of plus or minuses, even though they're not great, still affect the way in which you understand it. So the thing that we need the most for the best radiocarbon dating are carbonized remains of plants, because they're seasonal. So you are focusing in, a lot of the wood that is dated, it could be old wood to begin with, so that can confuse your dating. This just shows the carbonized corn cobs that were in one of those depositions. Again, we have a number of other cache pits. Cache pits are very, very common in this area. They go down about 1 meter generally in depth and spread out about 1.5 meters. They're a bell-shaped configuration. This then just shows the base of that one. That one had some expended bison scapula hose that were in the bottom of it that had been thrown away. The gardens that they had mounds of corn alternated with mounds of beans and then other crops, but they were using corn as the stalks for the beans to go up. The tool that was used there then was this bison scapula hoe. They also had rakes that were antler rakes, and then digging sticks. This is pre-steel, obviously. So again, if you look down, this is just an overview of one of the zones there that we're working on. Every artifact that is a diagnostic artifact, like a projectile point or a knife or something, is point plotted. So there are thousands of point plots taken each year. Again, we're using the Mitchell site as a training site for academically. So this is our 16th year to have part of our crew drawn from the University of Exeter in Exeter, England. They are in this cooperative venture with us. And then in turn, we also have students from Augustana. So they're usually this year there will be 18 students there. Again, this particular cache pit was extremely important because it yielded from the bottom and the sides preserved grass. This is the first example that we've found at Mitchell. This type of organic material rarely is preserved, and it's very important because, again, we come to have ever better understanding of how these pits were constructed. And also, so just a sequence here is an artist's reconstruction. They were dug by hand using probably bone tools to a large extent. They were lined with grass, and then the foodstuffs were passed down. And then after they were a storage situation. This is based on some work of Gilbert Wilson, anthropologist from the University of Minnesota back in 1915, working with some of the last village people on the Missouri River. This is just a description of, but it seems to fit the archaeological information perfectly as far as how these pits were constructed, layered, and grass was pinned to in other words, in clumps was pinned to the inside walls of them. Again, that was just to keep the pit fresh as long as possible. And then this is a reconstruction I've done of one of these that's over there at the museum, where you start out with a fresh pit. Over time it becomes spoiled because of rodents, insects, moisture, and so on. So eventually the pit is transformed from a food storage to a trash pit. So the trash pit is the way in which we as archaeologists, in almost every instance, that's the evidence we have. There are a few storage pits in some of the Missouri River sites that are more recent by about 300 or 400 years that we have found and recovered some that the pit was actually, not, the site was abandoned or something, and the pit was actually left with its foodstuffs in it. So again, records, and then more records, and then more records, and then a few more records, and then we try to collect some records. So we film it. In other words, film is, now digital is the least of your expenses, but mapping it also is very important so that they're dropping a plumb bob through this meter square screen that's on 10 centimeter squares to get as precision of position of the piece as possible as they draw it. One of the features we have several of there are these huge roasting pits where they were laying down a clay liner, heating rock, putting it on the clay liner, then getting packages of meat and vegetable material onto the hot rocks, then putting more hot rocks on top of that, then putting earth on top of that to make an earth oven or a baking oven. And this particular baking oven event had we've got about 7 layers so far of reuse. So again, this was a zone outdoors that was what we call an activity area where the people were coming back and reusing it and reusing it. They had dogs, huge number of dogs. We can't really calculate the dog population, but they were significant because they were an attraction animal. This is a photo from about 1905 from a site up in Montana showing the type of a travois that was being pulled by the dogs. So it's when the horse is reintroduced, that you begin to have a much larger beast of burden moving much heavier loads and so on. But the dogs, there's some villages that when Francis Lewis and Clark came through, a couple of the villages that they noted had population of say 400 to 500 people and a population of about 4,000 dogs. So the dog was a very significant animal in Plains Village. This is one of the crania that we've got. And of course, the whole question of domestication of the dog, in other words, it's an animal that emerges from the domestication of the wolf in the New World. And it's just, the question becomes one of how, where we are in the domestication process with the dogs at Mitchell. We've got several people from Max Planck Institute in Germany that are studying our dogs. And so some of them, as this shows, have very heavily worn down cusps and so on. So some of them lived to be fairly old. This just schematically shows the form of the pots at Mitchell. The mixture of material at Mitchell is important because some of the material is Cahokian, it's Mississippian. And the question there becomes one of, is it copies of the Mississippian material, or is it, are some of the vessels actually vessels that have come from Cahokia? And the answer is yes, both. So that's been a pretty important, we're doing a very complex residue analysis with a geochemist in England who's been able to extract residue from the pottery bodies themselves. And this will be a side note. Dr. Alan Outram, who is my colleague from the University of Exeter, he works at Mitchell and he also works in Kazakhstan. And he and his colleagues have definitively identified the earliest, certainly verifiable domestication of horses at a couple sites in Kazakhstan. And there's a film, I don't know whether some of you saw it on public broadcasting, there was a 3-part film produced called Equus, the story of the horse. The third part of that is going to be shown on Wednesday, the 15th at 8 o'clock in the evening, and it then will feature Alan at the sites that they're working at in Kazakhstan. So if anybody's interested in the prehistoric and the emergence of domestication of horses, it was actually by doing the residue studies that they were able to identify that in a very distinct type of cylinder vessel in the sites in Kazakhstan, they had the residue of mare's milk. And so the assumption is these probably were domesticated because it's hellishly difficult to milk a horse even today, although they do milk them there in Kazakhstan. So if they weren't, it must have been a great exercise. This shows just a miniaturization. These are probably things that were made for children to learn something about ceramics. The projectile points are, again, very small, but they're not bird points. They're used for bison. So they were lethal because they were being used with bow and arrow. Bow and arrow comes into the New World about 1,500 years ago and spreads across this hemisphere very, very quickly because it's a longer distance weapon, and you're able to do things with that you couldn't do with the earlier forms of either spears or atlatls. There are a lot of little effigy pieces on the pots. This is probably a wolf or a bear, perhaps. This is interesting. They collected clamshell, they collected clams. They're making these. Guess what this is?
Scraper.
Bear tie.
Spinner for fishing. It's a lure. They made little hooks that were exactly like modern fishing hooks, except they didn't have the back barb on them. And they then had this as part of their paraphernalia. We tested this, and actually, we were doing better catching fish with this than we were with some of the modern spinners. So it's amazing underwater. I mean, it looks exactly like a minnow. So it's a really ingenious piece. There are discs that were gaming discs. Knives. So I'm getting close. Projectile points, this is a very important point. We find about 4% of the projectile points being this type with a notch at the base. It's a Cahokia point, which very distinct. These points only have basal notches that are coming out of Cahokia. So it's either a copy of a Cahokian piece or it's actually a Cahokian-derived piece. Beads, both bone and stone. Drills. Again, this is just showing this particular one that we recovered. These were together. This is very important. Single piece of pottery. One of the most critical things we've found at Mitchell so far, because this is a red-slipped pottery, but it's not Plains, and it's not Mississippian, it's Cadonan. And we've traced this through an analysis to the Cadonan, one of the big Cadonan sites in Texas. So there's tremendous interplay and trade going on. How this would have, in other words, we're hoping to find some additional Cadonan material as we continue our excavations. But this piece, when it was in the bottom of one of the cache pits, and this gal says, "Is this of any particular consequence since it's red?" I was thinking, yeah, particular consequence because it's not Plains. So they had sickles that were made out of bison scapula, and they worked perfectly. I had some students from Exeter replicate a couple of these on bison scapula shoulder blades, and if you go out and draw together a bunch of grass, it cuts it as clean as any metal sickle. This shows that they were collecting red ochre, iron ferrite material, and grinding it. This is a paint palette. So they were doing some red slipping of pottery locally, along with, in other words, copying some of the Mississippian stuff coming out of the zone there on the Mississippi River. And then finally, we always have the obligatory stars that come in. This was one of these saucer cloud things. The students from England are always, let's say, wildly excited. They've never seen lightning and thunderstorms. And we usually can supply one or two of them in the summer for them. They're spectacular. So anyway, so then I guess I'll just make a real quick comment about this material, if it's all right. Afterwards, if anybody's interested, this is a case that just has a chronology of New World projectile points from the northern plains. So you start out with these large points that go back about 13,000 years in time, come across to about 7,000 years ago. These were spear points. These were part of what are known as the Paleo-Indian complex of points. The center points are what are part of a complex of archaic points that were used with the atlatl, or the dart thrower. And then finally, these points at the base are the points that are arrow points. There are also some handouts here, if anybody's interested, to go with that just shows you the different point types of the northern plains. The other thing I brought along, just for laughs, back in 1983, my colon ruptured, and I had a colostomy for a period of time, and then I had a resection of the colon. So the resection, I actually asked the surgeon if he'd be willing to use replicas of blades that were developed by the Mayan peoples about 2,500 years ago. These have an edge that is about 100 times sharper than modern surgical steel. Well, not a joke. It breaks on a single molecule of thickness. It's a very specialized type of flint knapping or stone working technique where you're using a chest punch to extract these blades. But there are a couple articles here on my surgery. So, but the thing is that whenever it gets dull enough in my class, I can always trot out the video of the surgery. And since I only teach classes at night, then it's always perfect. It's right after dinner. The other thing, I brought some, are there some kiddos here?
They're downstairs.
I've got a few copies of this. I don't know how many children there are, but I brought some copies of this poster, which is a poster of the Mitchell site. So if some of you have your children and would like to grab one of these.
Grandchildren.
Grandchildren.
Bring them back.
Yeah, so anyway. So, that's my story.